September 14th, 1987. 9:15 on a Monday night. A quiet street in Biloxi, Mississippi. Judge Vincent Sherry sat at the desk in his home office, working on legal files under a single lamp. His wife Margaret was in the back bedroom, on the phone, laughing with a friend. The doorbell rang. Vincent got up. He opened the front door. A man was standing there holding a 9mm pistol fitted with a homemade silencer. The first round hit Vincent in the chest. He staggered. 3 more rounds finished him on the living room floor. The shooter then walked calmly through the house to the back bedroom, where Margaret had just hung up the phone. She turned. She saw him. 5 shots. She died, slumped against the wall, her reading glasses still folded in her hand. The shooter walked back through the living room, stepped over Vincent's body, and let himself out. No sign of forced entry. No witnesses. No fingerprints. The whole thing took under 3 minutes. This wasn't some street hit gone wrong. Vincent Sherry was a sitting Mississippi Circuit Court judge. Margaret Sherry was a city councilwoman running for mayor of Biloxi on an anti-corruption platform. They had a daughter in law school. They had a son who was a federal agent. They were supposed to be untouchable. Instead, they became the first sitting judge and mayoral candidate in modern American history to be assassinated together in their own home. And the people who killed them weren't wearing pinstripe suits. They weren't kissing rings in some Brooklyn social club. They were a ragtag network of Southern outlaws, prison convicts, strip club owners, and crooked lawyers who operated under a name the FBI eventually coined the Dixie Mafia. This is the story of how a loose confederation of good old boys built a criminal empire across 6 southern states. How they ran prostitution, illegal gambling, murder for hire, and a bizarre mail fraud scheme that stole millions from lonely gay men. How they corrupted sheriffs, mayors, judges, and state legislators. How they may have played a role in the assassination of a United States president. And how, for almost 30 years, nobody could stop them. Because you can't decapitate an organization that has no head. But here's what makes this story different from every other mob story you've heard. The Dixie Mafia didn't have a godfather. They didn't take blood oaths. They didn't even have rules. And that's exactly what made them more dangerous than the 5 families ever were. You have to understand something about the American South in the 1960s. The Gulf Coast of Mississippi wasn't like the rest of the state. Biloxi, Gulfport, Pass Christian. These were strange hybrid places, half military town, half tourist trap, half Catholic enclave in a sea of Southern Baptists. During World War II, Keesler Air Force Base brought tens of thousands of young servicemen to Biloxi. The local economy figured out real fast what young servicemen wanted: booze, slot machines, women. A stretch of Highway 90 along the beach earned a nickname: the Strip. Neon lights, strip clubs, backroom poker games. Brothels operating under the thin cover of cocktail lounges. By 1960, the Strip was pulling in cash like a Vegas feeder stream, except it was all illegal. And here's the thing: nobody cared. The city ran on it. Cops took envelopes. Judges looked the other way. The mayor's office knew every club owner by first name. This was how Biloxi paid its bills. So when a guy named Mike Gillich opened a little strip joint on the Strip called Mr. Mike's Golden Nugget, nobody raised an eyebrow. Gillich was a Croatian immigrant's son. Short, thick, spoke with a heavy Gulf Coast drawl. He was in his 40s when he started collecting clubs and girls and gambling operations. He had 2 kids. He went to Mass on Sundays. He called everybody partner. And over 20 years, he quietly became the single most powerful criminal figure on the Mississippi Gulf Coast. But Gillich wasn't alone. He was part of a shifting regional network that law enforcement would eventually call the Dixie Mafia. The origins went back to Appalachia. Old whiskey runners, prohibition bootleggers, families that had been dodging federal tax agents since the 1800s. By the 1960s, their grandsons were running burglary rings, armed robbery crews, and contract killing services across 6 states: Texas, Louisiana, Arkansas, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi. They weren't Italian. They weren't Sicilian. They were cornbread and moonshine and small-town grudges. Journalists later called them the cornbread Cosa Nostra. Here's what made them different from anything the FBI had ever seen. They had no structure, no hierarchy, no godfather. Their one philosophy was simple. Whoever made the most money that year was the boss. And next year, if somebody else made more, he was the boss. They called each other on payphones from truck stops. They met in motel rooms off Interstate 10. They did jobs together, split the cash, and went their separate ways. A Texas armed robber might partner with a Georgia safecracker and an Alabama contract killer for one score, and then never see those men again for 3 years. Try prosecuting that. Try running a RICO case against a group that technically doesn't exist. The FBI didn't even have a name for them until the 1970s, and the man who would become their most notorious member grew up not in some southern backwater, but in the halls of the Oklahoma State Senate. His name was Kirksey Nix, Jr. His father, Kirksey Sr., was a highly respected Oklahoma Supreme Court justice. The Nix family was Southern aristocracy, money, law degrees, political connections going back generations. Young Kirksey was born in 1943. He could have been anything: governor, senator, federal judge. Instead, by the time he was 25, he was robbing homes at gunpoint across 3 states and running with every outlaw from Houston to Mobile. Kirksey was handsome, tall, dark hair slicked back, cold blue eyes. He drove Cadillacs and dated pageant winners. He read books. He could quote Shakespeare. And he was, according to everyone who knew him, completely without conscience. He'd be having dinner with a woman one night and pistol-whipping a grocery store owner to death the next morning. The FBI tracked him to break-ins, robberies, and at least 2 unsolved murders across the South throughout the late 60s. In 1967, his name got attached to one of the most famous crimes in Southern history, the attempt on the life of Sheriff Buford Pusser of McNairy County, Tennessee. The same sheriff who would later be immortalized in the movie Walking Tall. Pusser survived that ambush. His wife Pauline did not. For 58 years, Pusser blamed Kirksey Nix and the Dixie Mafia for his wife's murder. Nix never admitted anything, and here's the dark twist nobody saw coming. In 2025, a new investigation concluded that Buford Pusser himself had probably killed his own wife and framed the Dixie Mafia for it. That's how blurry the lines got down there. The hero cop might have been the killer. The convicted killer might have been innocent, and everybody knew everybody. In 1971, Kirksey Nix and a crew broke into the New Orleans home of a grocery executive named Frank Corso. What was supposed to be an armed robbery turned into a murder. Corso was shot to death in front of his family. Nix was arrested, tried, and in 1972 convicted of first-degree murder. The sentence was life without the possibility of parole at Louisiana State Penitentiary. Angola, the meanest prison in the American South, built on an old slave plantation surrounded by swamp and razor wire. When the judge said the words, life without parole, the courtroom expected that to be the end of Kirksey Nix. It was the beginning, because here's what you need to understand about Angola in the 1970s and 1980s. The place was for sale. Guards took money. Wardens looked the other way. If you had cash on the outside, you could buy privileges inside. A private cell, your own telephone, visitors around the clock, drugs, women. Nix had all of that. He ran his cell block like a corporate office. He had a private secretary. He had 3 separate phone lines that guards kept charged for him. He had a laptop computer years before most free people owned one, and from that cell, he ran what became one of the most profitable, most bizarre criminal enterprises in American history. They called it the Lonely Hearts Scam. Here's how it worked. In the early 1980s, Nix and a small crew started placing personal ads in national gay magazines. The biggest was The Advocate. The ads pretended to be from young, good-looking, single gay men looking for companionship. They included photographs, usually cut out from magazines, of attractive models. Men across America, closeted, lonely, isolated, would write in long, heartfelt letters, photos of themselves. They'd get warm letters back, love letters, promises. A fantasy relationship built entirely through the mail. And then, always, a problem. I got arrested for drunk driving and I need bail money. My mom is dying and I can't afford the hospital. I lost my job and I'm about to be evicted. Can you help me? Please. I love you. Men wired thousands of dollars, sometimes tens of thousands, to strangers they would never meet. Men mortgaged their homes. Men drained their retirement accounts. A few killed themselves when they realized they had been taken. Nix's crew brought in roughly $8 to $10 million from that scam over the course of the 1980s. Some estimates go higher. The money came in through Western Union offices, bank wires, and cash drops all across the South. To launder it, Nix used a trust account at a law firm in Biloxi, Mississippi. The firm was called Hallett and Sherry. Remember that name. But Nix wasn't building the empire just to be rich in a prison cell. He had a bigger plan. He was going to buy his way out of Angola. Specifically, he wanted to purchase a pardon from the governor of Louisiana. In the 1980s, Louisiana governors had the absolute power to issue pardons, and more than one of them turned out to be willing to sell. Nix's goal was $1 million in cash. That's what he believed a pardon would cost. He was stockpiling Lonely Hearts money in the Hallett and Sherry trust account, building his exit fund, one heartbroken victim at a time. Now, let's meet the man sitting on all that money. Peter Hallett, born in Biloxi in July 1942. Law degree, smooth, polished, charming, the kind of Southern lawyer who remembered your wife's birthday and your kids' names. By the early 1980s, he was the unofficial house counsel for half the strip club owners on the Strip, including Mike Gillick. He was also the attorney of record for Kirksey Nix. In 1981, Hallett took on a new law partner, a former federal prosecutor named Vincent Sherry. On paper, they were a perfect match. Hallett handled the strip club cases and the quiet stuff. Sherry handled the clean cases. Together, they built a respected firm. Vincent Sherry wasn't clean in the way saints are clean. He'd grown up in Biloxi. He knew how the coast worked. He'd represented some of these same Dixie Mafia guys earlier in his career. But by the 1980s, Vincent was turning a corner. His wife, Margaret, was turning into a civic crusader. Margaret Sherry was a Biloxi city councilwoman. She was loud. She was fearless. She stood up at council meetings and named the strip clubs by name. She talked about the gambling, the prostitution, the police corruption. She said the word Dixie Mafia out loud in council chambers where nobody said that word. And in 1987, she announced she was running for mayor of Biloxi on a platform to clean up the Strip once and for all. On July 28, 1986, Vincent Sherry was appointed as a Mississippi Circuit Court judge. He left the Hallett and Sherry law firm to take the bench. Margaret kept pushing for mayor, and somewhere during all of that, Pete Hallett had a problem. He had been stealing from Kirksey Nix. Over the course of several years, Hallett had quietly dipped into the Lonely Hearts money. A little here, a little there, covering his own financial shortfalls, living a lifestyle. By late 1986, the amount missing from the trust account had climbed to approximately $100,000, and Kirksey Nix, sitting in his cell at Angola, was starting to notice. He made a phone call. He wanted to see Pete Hallett in person, now. In December 1986, Pete Hallett drove the 4.5 hours from Biloxi to Angola and walked into that prison to have a conversation with a man who had already murdered at least one person and was serving life without parole. Hallett sat across from Kirksey Nix. Nix asked him where the money was, and Pete Hallett did something that would eventually get 2 people killed. He looked Kirksey Nix in the eye, and he said it was Vincent Sherry who stole it, his old law partner, the newly appointed judge. He sold out an innocent man to save himself. Kirksey Nix believed him, and in that moment, inside that prison visitors' room, the deaths of Vincent and Margaret Sherry were already written. Here's where it gets interesting. Nix didn't just want Vincent dead. He wanted Margaret dead, too. Why? Because Margaret Sherry was running for mayor on a platform that would directly hurt Mike Gillich's operations. Gillich was the man who protected Nix on the outside. Gillich was also one of Nix's closest friends. And Gillich had been telling Nix for months that Margaret Sherry was a problem that needed to go away. So now Kirksey Nix had two targets and one plan. Kill them both. Make it look like a robbery. Make it look random. Mike Gillich got the assignment. Gillich reached out to a man named John Ransom, a longtime Dixie Mafia enforcer from Georgia. Ransom was in his late 50s, quiet, professional, a veteran of 3 decades of Southern outlaw work. Ransom supplied the weapon, a 9mm handgun with a homemade silencer attached. Ransom handed the gun to Sherry Lara Sharp, a young woman who was Kirksey Nix's girlfriend on the outside. Sharp worked as a legal aide at the Hallett and Sherry law firm. She was the operational hub of the Lonely Hearts scam. She handed the gun to the man who would pull the trigger. His name was Thomas Leslie Holcomb, a contract killer out of Texas, 52 years old at the time of the hit, thin, dead-eyed, had spent his adult life moving between prisons and payoffs. He drove from Texas to Biloxi in early September 1987. He studied the Sherry house. He learned their routines. Vincent left for his courthouse chambers early every morning. Margaret came home late from council meetings. Their kids were grown and gone. Weekday nights, the house would be empty except for the two of them. On the evening of September 14th, 1987, Holcomb parked his car down the street from the Sherry home. He waited until full dark. He walked up to the front door. He rang the bell. And he murdered a judge and a mayoral candidate with 9 rounds from a silenced pistol. Then he drove back to Texas, got paid, disappeared into the anonymous America of trucker motels and highway diners. For 2 years, nothing. The Biloxi Police Department and the Harrison County Sheriff's Office worked the case. They came up empty. Which shouldn't have surprised anybody, because the Harrison County Sheriff's Office had already been officially designated by federal authorities in 1983 as a criminal enterprise. Sheriff Leroy Hobbs had been running the department like a Dixie Mafia franchise, releasing prisoners for cash, safeguarding drug shipments, hiding fugitives. Hobbs was convicted of racketeering in 1984 and sentenced to 20 years. But the rot in the department ran deep. Investigating a Dixie Mafia hit through the Harrison County Sheriff's Office was like asking a fox to investigate a chicken coop massacre. Here's where the FBI finally came in. In 1989, Special Agent Royce Hignite, working with Special Agent Keith Bell, a Gulf Coast native who had grown up watching this corruption firsthand, opened a federal investigation. Not just into the Sherry murders, into everything. The Dixie Mafia as a whole, the Lonely Hearts scam, the corruption of the Sheriff's Department, the strip club empire, the political influence of Mike Gillich. And what they uncovered over 8 years of painstaking work was one of the largest public corruption cases in Mississippi history. The FBI seized bank records. They tapped phones. They turned witnesses. One of the first cracks came when investigators tracked Lonely Hearts money flowing out of the Halott and Sherry trust account. That led them to Sherry Lara Sharp. Sharp cracked. She didn't give them everything, but she gave them enough. Then came John Ransom. Ransom was an old man by 1990. He didn't want to die in a federal prison. He started talking. He talked about the gun. He talked about the drive from Texas. He talked about Mike Gillich. In 1991, the first indictments came down. Kirksey Nix, Mike Gillich, Sherry Lara Sharp, and John Ransom were all convicted of wire fraud, conspiracy, and travel in aid of murder for hire. Nix and Gillich got hit with the murder-related charges. But here's what's wild. Pete Halott was not indicted in 1991. He was still walking around Biloxi, a free man. In fact, in 1989, just 2 years after orchestrating the assassination of his former law partner and that partner's wife, Pete Halott had successfully run for mayor of Biloxi. He won. He served from 1989 to 1993. He lost his re-election bid in 1993 by just 17 votes out of 8,564 cast. 17 votes. If those votes had gone the other way, Pete Hallett would have remained mayor of Biloxi while the FBI closed in on him for a double homicide. Then, in 1994, the whole thing broke open. Mike Gillich, now in his mid-60s, facing the rest of his life in federal prison, made a deal. He agreed to cooperate. He agreed to testify. He agreed to tell the federal government everything he knew about the Dixie Mafia, Kirksey Nix, and Pete Hallett. Once Gillich flipped, there was nowhere left to hide. On October 23, 1996, Pete Hallett was indicted on federal charges related to the murders of Vincent and Margaret Sherry, the former mayor, the respected attorney, the man who had delivered eulogies at Vincent Sherry's funeral. The trial took place in 1997. The prosecution laid out the entire conspiracy, Hallett's theft from the trust account, the visit to Angola, the lie he told Nix, the payment to Gillich, the handoff of the gun, the murder itself. The jury convicted Pete Hallett of conspiracy to commit racketeering, obstruction of justice, conspiracy to obstruct justice, and conspiracy to commit wire fraud. He was sentenced to 18 years in federal prison. Thomas Holcomb, the actual shooter, was convicted of the murders and sent to Mississippi's Parchman prison for life. He died in his cell in 2005 at age 52. John Ransom was released from federal prison in late 2003 at age 76. He went back to the Atlanta area and lived out his final years quietly. Sherry Lara Sharp did her federal time. Mike Gillich, the kingpin of the Strip, the unofficial boss of the Mississippi Dixie Mafia, served reduced time thanks to his cooperation. He died of cancer in 2012 at age 82. Kirksey Nix is still alive, still in federal custody. He's been moved to the Federal Correctional Institution at El Reno, Oklahoma. He'll die in that cell. Pete Hallett was released in April 2013 after serving 15 years, 9 months, and 7 days. He walked out of a federal halfway house at age 70. He went to work briefly at a church in Hattiesburg. To this day, he publicly maintains that he had no role in the murders of Vincent and Margaret Sherry. But let's back up, because the story of the Dixie Mafia is bigger than the Sherry case, a lot bigger. And there's one corner of it that researchers have been arguing about for over 60 years, the possible Dixie Mafia connection to the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. Here's what we actually know. Carlos Marcello was the mafia boss of New Orleans. He ran gambling, prostitution, and political corruption across Louisiana, Mississippi, and Texas from the 1940s until his death in 1993. Marcello hated the Kennedy family. Robert Kennedy, as Attorney General, had literally put Carlos Marcello on a plane, flown him to Guatemala, and dumped him in a jungle in an attempt to deport him in 1961. Marcello had to sneak back into the United States through dirt roads and contacts in Central America. He swore revenge. The United States House Select Committee on Assassinations, in its final 1979 report, concluded that Carlos Marcello had both the motive and the means to have killed John F. Kennedy, and that organized crime likely played a role in the assassination. Now here's where the Dixie Mafia comes in. Marcello operated in the same territory as the Dixie Mafia. He did business with Dixie Mafia hitmen. He used Dixie Mafia couriers. And in the small, incestuous world of Southern organized crime in 1963, many of the names that come up in JFK assassination research, names of contract killers, middlemen, gun runners, and fixers operating out of Dallas, New Orleans, and the Gulf Coast, were men who also appear in Dixie Mafia case files. Some researchers have argued for decades that the actual wet work on November 22, 1963, was subcontracted to Dixie Mafia shooters hired by Marcello. That's never been proven. It may never be proven. The federal investigators who worked the Sherry case decades later were explicit. They could connect the Dixie Mafia to dozens of murders across the South. Kennedy was not one they could prove. but it stays in the air. It stays in the files. And every time someone asks who really killed Kennedy, the Dixie Mafia is in the mix of possibilities. What's documented is this. By the early 1980s, the Dixie Mafia was responsible for an estimated 150 murders across the southern United States. Contract killings, silencing witnesses, rival disputes, business gone wrong. They ran illegal gambling operations that pulled in tens of millions of dollars a year. They ran prostitution rings that stretched from El Paso to Atlanta. They corrupted sheriffs in at least 4 states. They corrupted state legislators. They put federal judges on payroll. And they did it all without ever forming a single recognizable organization. The FBI couldn't use RICO on them the way they used it on the 5 families in New York, because there was no family to RICO. There was just a phone network, a series of relationships, a culture, which brings us to the real lesson of the Dixie Mafia story. American organized crime was never just Italians in Brooklyn. It was never just the 5 families. While federal prosecutors in New York were building careers on RICO cases against Gotti and Gambino and Lucchese, a whole other criminal ecosystem was operating unchecked across the American South. They ran more territory. They killed more people. They corrupted more institutions. And almost nobody outside the Gulf Coast knew their name. The Italian Mafia had a code: omerta, honor, family. Rules about who you could kill and who you couldn't. Judges were off limits. Cops were off limits. Women and children were off limits. The Dixie Mafia had no code, no rules, no honor. They killed a judge in his own home. They killed a mayoral candidate in her back bedroom. They scammed lonely gay men out of their life savings. They murdered a sheriff's wife. They did whatever the money told them to do, which is why the Italian mobsters who knew them, and there were many, because the 2 worlds overlapped in New Orleans and across the Gulf, were afraid of them. Because an Italian wise guy could sit down at a table with another Italian wise guy and negotiate. There were rules. There was a way. With the Dixie Mafia, there was no table. There was no rule book. There was just a phone call, a handshake in a parking lot, and a body in a ditch. The Sherry murders were supposed to be the perfect crime. A judge with no obvious mob ties, a respected lawyer cutting his own deal, a shooter from Texas paid in cash, a kingpin giving orders from a prison cell 300 miles away. Under the old rules, that case should have gone cold and stayed cold. What the Dixie Mafia didn't understand was that the federal government was no longer bound by county lines. Royce Hignite and Keith Bell didn't care that the Harrison County Sheriff was dirty. They went around the sheriff. They built the case one witness at a time, one wire record at a time, one flipped informant at a time. It took 8 years, but they dismantled most of the network. Margaret Sherry's son, Vincent Jr., later became a federal prosecutor. He helped other federal agents build cases against organized crime in the South. Her daughter Lynn became a law professor. The Sherry family home at Hickory Hill Circle was eventually torn down. Too many people driving by to gawk. Too many bad memories. The Strip in Biloxi is mostly gone now. The gambling moved legal when Mississippi legalized casino gaming on the Gulf Coast in the early 1990s. Hurricane Katrina in August 2005 finished off most of the old clubs that were still standing. Mr. Mike's Golden Nugget, the Fiesta. The lounges where Nix and Gillich had built an empire, all gone. But the Dixie Mafia itself didn't die. It just faded. The original generation, the men who had come up in the 1960s, they're mostly dead or in prison. But the network they built, that loose confederation of Southern criminals, never really went away. Federal law enforcement still uses the term. They still track the descendants, the trucking routes, the prison relationships, the old motel meeting spots, drug trafficking, methamphetamine rings, prison gang alliances. The same structure is there. It just has new faces. Here's what you should take away from all of this. The Italian Mafia, with all its Hollywood glamour, its godfathers and consiglières and maid guys, was in the end a knowable thing. Rules. Hierarchy. Family. You could draw the chart. You could name the boss. You could prosecute the boss and cripple the family. The Dixie Mafia showed that organized crime doesn't need any of that. It just needs a network of men willing to kill for money and a society willing to look the other way. Every institution in Biloxi looked the other way for 30 years. The cops, the judges, the city council, the mayor, the voters who kept electing the same corrupt officials. It took the murder of a judge's wife in her own bedroom, with her reading glasses in her hand, to finally force people to care. Kirksey Nix spent his life building an empire from a prison cell. He ran scams. He ordered murders. He bought judges. He came within a whisper of buying a pardon from the governor of Louisiana. He made more money and wielded more power from inside Angola than most free men ever dream of. And he will die in a federal cell in El Reno, Oklahoma, having spent more than 54 consecutive years behind bars. Pete Halat, the smiling Biloxi mayor who delivered a eulogy at his own partner's funeral, served 15 years for orchestrating those deaths and walked out a free man at age 70. Mike Gillich, the strip club king of the Strip, flipped and died quietly of cancer at 82. Vincent and Margaret Sherry never got to see their children grow up, never got to meet their grandchildren, never got to find out whether Margaret would have been elected mayor. That's the real story of the Dixie Mafia. Not the JFK conspiracy theories, not the romantic myth of Southern outlaws. The truth is uglier than that. It's the story of what happens when money, power, and apathy collide in a small Southern town. It's the story of men who weren't godfathers, but killers for hire. Men who didn't wear pinstripe suits, but cowboy boots. Men who didn't swear blood oaths, but kept their word for $1,000 a head. They were, in their own way, more American than the Italian mob ever was. They came from the mountains and the swamps. They built their empires with bad intentions and worse accents. And when they were finally exposed, the country discovered that the most dangerous criminals in America had been hiding in plain sight, in the strip clubs and courthouses of a small coastal town nobody ever looked at twice. If this story pulled you in, hit that subscribe button. We drop new mob documentaries every single week. Scroll down and tell us in the comments which Dixie Mafia figure deserves his own full documentary. Kirksey Nix, Mike Gillich, Carlos Marcello. Drop the name. We read every comment. Until next time, stay curious, stay careful, and remember, some of the biggest criminals in American history never wore a suit.